Remember that when you're watching a vodcast, if I'm going too fast, you can pause me, you can rewind me if you need to catch something again. If you want to follow along, I'm in Module 2 of Unit 1 on pages 11 and 12. And what I want to talk about is probably one of the most fundamentally important parts of the unit, and that's the 7 approaches of psychology. Now, nomenclature. Nomen means name. So sometimes students get confused because different textbooks in psychology use approaches, some use perspectives, some use schools. Okay, but there are 7 modern ones. Most books will agree upon that, even if they'll use slightly different names like biological or biopsychological for the biological approach. Okay, so I want to show you though how that you should be connecting these 7 perspectives or approaches to what comes at the latter half of Module 2, which we did not have a chance to go over, which are the subfields in psychology. And then also in Module 3, there's the careers. You are responsible for that, right? So let me show you how the subfields connect to the approaches, okay? All right, so one of the most prominent subfields in psychology, and we will have an entire unit on it, is called developmental psychology. Now, developmental psychology, you can look at the definition on page 14. It usually looks at certain abilities that humans have, say like reasoning or memory, and it wants to look at how those abilities change or stay the same over the lifetime of the organism, the human, right? So for instance, let's just take critical thinking. Are the critical thinking skills of a child, say who's 4 years old, the same as an adolescent who's 14? Right? Common sense tells me no, and they actually are not. But remember, we want to study that. We want to analyze it in a systematic way. So that's what a developmental psychologist might do. They might look at the critical thinking abilities of, say, either children or they might compare children to young adults. So far, so good? But here's the cool part about how subfields are connected to approaches. If I'm studying critical thinking, perhaps I am a psychologist, and not all do, who pretty much approaches all of the topics of inquiry for me, in this case critical thinking, from a biological perspective. So I might be a developmental psychologist, a subfield, who takes a biological approach to understanding that which I study, which is critical thinking in young children. Or perhaps I'm a cognitive psychologist, right, who looks at critical thinking from a purely cognitive or primarily cognitive perspective. Or maybe I am a behaviorist, or maybe I focus on socio-cultural aspects of critical thinking, right? So basically, I can be a developmental psychologist, a subfield of psychology, and I can use a particular lens, an approach to understanding whatever topic, critical thinking, memory, etc., right? Okay, and that's the same for all of those other subfields. I can be an educational psychologist who is a behaviorist, okay? Now, I don't have to be. I can be what's called eclectic and use multiple approaches. But here's the important part here. You should be thinking, as a student, right? Like say I'm in grad school and I want to understand critical thinking in young children. Probably to get the fullest picture of critical thinking, you would actually have to read this person's research, this person's research, this person's research, and this person's research. That's actually accurate, right? Because no one perspective usually gives us the totality of meaning we're looking for. Okay? All right, this should set you up for kind of what comes next. But before I get there, I want to show you one more quick slide. And that's this one. Okay? All right, how would I study for the approaches and perspectives? Because remember I said it's really important. The first thing I would do is I would test myself. And I did this in one of the blocks. I think I did it in block 3, but not block 2. Make a list, just like I made here, from memory, right? Not in a multiple choice, that's called recognition, but try to recall them. At this point, you've read 3 readings on this. You should be able to make a list of all 7 of these approaches, right? From memory. You should have this down, okay? So that would be step 1. Step 2, I would go into more detail, and I'm going to compare it to chemistry, okay? Remember that chemistry, remember the periodic table, right? And chemistry basically says reality, matter is made up of things look like this, right? We have a nucleus here, right, of whatever element, that's an N, not an M, sorry. We have the nucleus here, pen's hard to write with, and then in these kind of ellipses, we have what's called electrons, which are negatively charged particles that kind of rotate around in this kind of elliptical shape around the nucleus, right? And each element has a different number of electrons, right, on each of these ellipses, right? Okay, this is how I would use this to study. Let's take humanistic psychology, right? We've got our nucleus, humanistic psychology. And remember we have the electrons that go around the nucleus? What I would do is I would use characteristics or information you've learned to fill in. The information is like the electrons. So for instance, maybe what comes to your mind are the people associated with this. Those would be your electrons, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, right? And now we have more electrons. It might be key vocabulary like self-actualization. Now you have another ellipse. I'm not drawing it all the way around, but you know it goes all the way around. It might be that this emerges in the 1960s in reaction to this and in reaction to this. It was dissatisfied with those two perspectives because they seem to like limit human freedom, right? This one we're controlled by unconscious desires. This one we seem to be controlled by our learning history. Our past rewards and reinforcements seem to shape us as opposed to our individual choices. These people believe in human freedom and the idea that that freedom is used to make us, that we all desire to be the best we can be. So we have human nature is good. In this perspective, human nature is conflicted, right? Human nature is good. And when the environments are supportive and loving and caring, humans are able to be the best they can be. So the humanistic approach does care about the environment. It just looks at the environment differently than this one. Okay? This one sees the environment just in terms of stimuli and response. This one sees environments in terms of, are they loving and supporting? Do they allow people to reach their fullest potential? And that people have freedom to do that. So you have to understand that human freedom is in reaction to this and this. That's all in your book. You can do that for each one. Okay. Now, remember what I said earlier about looking at critical thinking in children and to really get a full understanding? I shouldn't even say full understanding. I should say a better understanding, maybe a more complete understanding. We never come to a full understanding of anything, do we? But a fuller understanding, I would use this levels of analysis. So when Myers brings this up, and he brings it up on page 11, right? And I'm flipping to the page myself to look at it. What we're really trying to look at is the perspectives, like I talked about earlier, are specific, right? Those 7 perspectives. The levels of analysis, however, says that most psychology today embraces what's really called an eclectic approach. The early behaviorists, remember, they thought they were right and they thought the structuralists were wrong. Modern day psychology at its best, doesn't mean every single psychologist believes this, but psychology at its best now says, wait a minute, we can have all of these specific approaches, but the best way to understand any kind of behavior, remember, our mental process, is to actually take an eclectic approach. So this combination of these perspectives, because human behavior and mental processes are often extremely complex and cannot be reduced. Okay? So this eclectic approach is what's called the biopsychosocial approach. Okay? The biopsychosocial approach is an approach that's connected to those levels of analysis that tries to combine multiple perspectives to get the best understanding of any type of behavior or mental process. Let's go into more detail. This is connected to the picture in your book on page 11 that's really good. So in the blue, you can put anything here. You can put depression, you can put aggression, you can put perception. And what levels of analysis is saying, it's not saying that every psychologist is eclectic. It's saying to understand any type of behavior or mental process, the best way to do is to combine these multiple perspectives. Now, just a word of caution. This confuses students. This is not the same exact thing as simply the biological perspective. This means all things biological. Okay? It means the evolutionary theory as well. Okay? This is not just the socio-cultural, but it combines a lot of that into its approach. Okay? And this combines multiple perspectives. So what does all of this mean? Let's give you an example. I can't remember the exact research here, so I'm gonna kind of make up a little of it, use different names and so forth. But there was this really cool research done years ago on perception of visual stimuli, not in the Gestalt way. There were two college teams playing football. Let's say Cal versus UCLA. Go Bears, right? And basically, they had the UCLA fans watch the game by themselves. The Cal fans watch the game by themselves. Same game. Then they asked them questions like about which team committed more penalties, which team played dirtier, and etc. And wouldn't you know it, the Cal fans believed that their team committed less penalties. UCLA believed their team committed less penalties. All of these questions were answered in such a way that showed that people's motivation influenced their perception. People's motivation, people's beliefs, people's desires. Sorry, it's really hard to write with this pen, right? So people's beliefs, people's motivation, people's desires influence people's perception. That would be taking into consideration the psychological level of analysis, right? How do all of these things influence perception, right? Obviously, biological is kind of self-explanatory here, right? Has to do with how our occipital lobe works, how our eyes work, right? Things of that nature. Social would be things like, remember, for some phenomenon, certain levels of analysis take precedence over others. But for the social, it could be, think about it, does the presence of other people influence the way we behave sometimes? We tend to laugh more about 40% more in the presence of other people than we laugh when we're alone, right? How many times do you laugh when you're alone? Sometimes, but we laugh more in the presence of other people. So the social or the social cultural influences are looking at the presence of other people. It looks at social norms, right? Do norms and expectations influence the way we behave? So that's the levels of analysis. So remember, the key here is that when we say biological here, we mean all biological influences, and some books just say social, some say social cultural, and that one's pretty self-explanatory, and I gave you some examples of what we would mean by the psychological lens. But remember, this is a way of looking at phenomenon that says it's best to be eclectic to fully understand any phenomenon.